The cold air of the Walmart at 2 a.m. carried a sense of unnatural stillness, as though the fluorescent lights themselves were complicit in guarding a secret. The shelves loomed like silent sentinels, their metallic edges reflecting the occasional flicker of a failing bulb. In the far aisle, a figure moved deliberately, a trench coat brushing against the linoleum floor, head low, eyes scanning every corner with a trained vigilance that suggested more than mere shopping. To the uninitiated, it was just a late-night errand. To those who understood the hidden currents of espionage, every step was a calculated act of tradecraft. For weeks, the FBI had observed him from afar, tracking movements that seemed innocuous, yet carried the weight of something deeply clandestine. The agents had noted the patterns: visits at odd hours, brief encounters with strangers who never lingered, gestures too precise to be casual. There was a rhythm to the man's movements, a cadence that revealed an underlying strategy that only the trained eye could decipher. He paused, glancing toward the security camera above, tilting his head in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. It was a silent acknowledgement, a fleeting signal to someone watching from a distance, though no one in uniform knew exactly who or where. The air seemed to thicken around him as he reached for an item on the shelf. The mundane act layered with tension, the weight of history pressing down in the shadows of fluorescent light. Somewhere in the network of observation rooms, analysts traced his path with painstaking care, connecting dots that led not to grocery aisles, but to a wider lattice of covert operations stretching back decades. The moment was frozen, yet alive with the potential of imminent revelation, the kind of instant that intelligence officers recognize as the calm before an inevitable storm. Then, without warning, he vanished from the aisle, swallowed by the labyrinthine layout, leaving a trail of questions in his wake that would unravel slowly, meticulously, in the days to come. Inside the cramped confines of a black surveillance van, the hum of machinery and whispered communication created a cocoon of tension. Analysts huddled over monitors, eyes darting across screens that displayed every corner of the parking lot, every motion within the aisles. There was a ritual to their observation, a choreography of counter-surveillance awareness and methodical recording that demanded both patience and intuition. Each gesture, each glance of the suspect was logged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced against years of intelligence protocols designed to catch operatives just like him. Outside, the fog shifted like a living entity, swallowing the van in a muted gray haze. The scent of wet asphalt and faint coffee lingered in the air, grounding the agents in the grim reality of their task. Through the lenses, the suspect's movements became almost cinematic, deliberate pauses near exit doors, subtle exchanges with unknown figures who melted back into the night before anyone could intercept. One agent noted the slight hesitation in his step, a behavioral tic that suggested internal conflict, perhaps even a measure of paranoia. Every minute was a study in human psychology, every pattern a breadcrumb leading closer to understanding the mind of a spy who operated under layers of deception. Intelligence officers whispered theories about his motivations, debating whether he was driven by ideology, fear, or an intricate personal calculus. The van's interior vibrated with silent anticipation as the man re-emerged, carrying a brown paper bag with no groceries, leaving only questions that the monitors could not answer. A sudden movement on the side camera drew the agent's attention, and in that instant, they realized that the line between hunter and hunted was far thinner than any of them had imagined. The night carried a quiet so thick it seemed to press against the chest of anyone who dared to breathe. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving slick reflections of streetlights in the puddles that coated the asphalt. The empty parking lot of a rundown convenience store was transformed into a stage of invisible choreography. In the halo of a single flickering street lamp, the man in the trench coat waited, the collar turned up against the cold, his eyes sweeping methodically across the lot. Every shadow was a potential threat, every glint of light a signal he could not ignore. The ritual of waiting was something he had known intimately for years. The training embedded deep in his muscle memory dictated that he remain patient, that he study the contours of the terrain as carefully as he studied the people he encountered. The FBI's monitors, somewhere far away, would later replay the moment in painstaking slow motion, each second dissected for clues that even he was too disciplined to leave visible. Footsteps approached, muffled against the rain-slick asphalt, deliberate and measured. Another figure emerged from the darkness, trench coat similarly heavy, hat low, face obscured. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition that was more code than expression. And in that brief instant, decades of Cold War practice coalesced into a single silent understanding. The envelope was small, unassuming, almost banal to any casual observer, but within it lay a fragment of history encoded in microfilm, a repository of secrets that could shift allegiances and end careers, secrets that moved faster than any army, faster than any politician could hope to respond. The exchange was executed with meticulous precision. Hands brushed in a motion so casual it could have been mistaken for a passing greeting. The envelope changed possession, almost weightless, but the gravity of its contents pressed down invisibly. The two men continued to converse in short bursts, the language of double agents, sentences heavy with deliberate ambiguity. Every word, every pause, every hesitation was a potential signal. There was no laughter, no small talk, no sense of normalcy, only the rhythm of espionage, measured and unyielding. The FBI had reconstructed this encounter from the tiniest scraps of surveillance intelligence. Cameras had been positioned across the street in an adjacent alley, the van's night vision lenses catching details that could otherwise vanish into darkness. Agents watched as the man surveyed the perimeter, shifting his weight subtly, aware that any misstep could be fatal. The shadow behind the lamppost moved with him, in and out of frame, a phantom tail perhaps, or a misdirection deliberately planted to obscure the trail. The envelope changed hands, the receiver tucking it carefully beneath the coat, fingers brushing against the cold fabric as though testing its weight. The tension in the air was not just in the moment, but stretched backward and forward in time. The man thought of the months of planning that had led here, of the network of operatives and handlers who had orchestrated these exchanges, the signals they relied upon, the dead drops hidden in unremarkable locations. One miscalculation and years of careful operation could collapse in an instant. The thought that someone, somewhere, could have been watching, not as part of the choreography, but as a silent predator, was a constant undercurrent. They exchanged no names. Names were unnecessary, dangerous. Each had been given a series of numbers and letters, a coded reference, and that sufficed. Each gesture carried significance. A tap on the shoulder, a nod of the head, a half-step backward. All part of a language invisible to anyone who had not been trained to see it. The operative's eyes flicked toward the shadows, noting shapes that could be curious onlookers, stray pedestrians, the occasional car idling too long in the distance. Every movement was catalogued, weighed, and filed in his mind, a mental map of risk and probability. As the transaction concluded, the first figure receded into the darkness with the envelope secured, blending seamlessly into the urban landscape. His steps were silent, purposeful. The man remaining in the light shifted slightly, adjusting his hat to obscure his face further, and then moved in the opposite direction. For a casual observer, it was merely two strangers leaving a deserted parking lot. For those attuned to the choreography, every step spoke volumes. The FBI analysts watching from their screens leaned forward, noting subtle micro-expressions, shifts in stance, and the timing of movements. A pause too long, a glance too fleeting, could betray an operative's inner calculation. Every frame was evidence, every shadow a potential clue. The streets themselves were complicit, echoing footsteps, reflecting the light, amplifying uncertainty. Rainwater pooled in the uneven asphalt, breaking the reflections of lamplight into fractured patterns. A perfect analog for the fractured loyalties and hidden motives that had been operating unseen for decades. The man's mind was a catalog of possibilities. He imagined what might be happening at the FBI offices at that very moment. Analysts poring over his movements, trying to discern the logic behind his every decision. Did they know who he was? Or were they following shadows, patterns with no face? He could not afford to know. Ignorance was part of survival. His next step was deliberate, moving toward the edge of the lot where the fog thickened, swallowing outlines of cars, concrete barriers, and trash cans. Every sense was heightened, every nerve alert to the subtle vibrations of an urban environment that could betray him. A distant dog barked, a car door slammed, the faint hiss of tires over wet asphalt. Each sound registered as a potential interruption. He slowed, pivoting to check over his shoulder, aware that the choreography of espionage demanded awareness not just of immediate threats, but of the potential for delayed consequences. There was a ritual to these exchanges, one taught and reinforced over countless exercises, simulations, and real-world operations. The envelope would not be opened here. It would be delivered to a safe location, a secure site where the microfilm could be examined without interference. The operative had memorized these locations, encoded them in ways that even he could only recall under stress, with redundancy built into redundancy. Nothing could be left to chance. Every possible contingency was accounted for, and yet there was always a margin for the unexpected, the unknown variable, that human flaw or chance event that could unravel everything. As he disappeared into the fog, the weight of what had just occurred pressed on him, almost physically. The envelope contained not just intelligence, but the fragile trust of a network that had endured under extraordinary conditions. Years of clandestine activity, the careful orchestration of signals and countersignals, training and improvisation, all condensed into this singular, fleeting exchange. In the distance, the faint glow of another street lamp illuminated a figure moving with equal caution. Was this a shadow, a tail, or another link in the chain? It was impossible to say, and that uncertainty was part of the calculus, part of the tension that defined every moment of his existence. Even as he vanished into the night, the city remained unaware of the theater that had just unfolded. To the casual observer, there was nothing extraordinary, nothing worth noticing. The parking lot would be cleaned, lights would flicker and die, and the rain would continue to fall. Yet beneath the surface, layers of espionage, strategy, and human psychology had played out, leaving traces that only trained eyes could discern. The FBI, watching from miles away, would later attempt to reconstruct every second, every gesture, every blink, to anticipate the next move. They knew that if they failed to understand even the smallest detail, the operation could slip from their grasp entirely. In that fleeting intersection of time and space, two worlds collided. the hidden world of covert exchange and the visible world of urban night. The envelope passed hands, history held its breath, and the dance of espionage continued, invisible to most, yet consequential in ways that would only reveal themselves much later. The man disappeared completely, swallowed by the city's fog, leaving behind only questions. And in the control room, agents exchanged glances. Something in the manner of the exchange did not fit the expected patterns. A subtle anomaly that promised answers and danger far beyond what they had anticipated. The chase was far from over. The corridors of the embassy were cold and sterile, yet they hummed with a quiet intensity that could almost be felt in the soles of one's shoes. Marble floors gleamed under muted overhead lights, reflecting shadows that stretched and shifted like living things. The man moved carefully, his trench coat brushing against the polished stone, a silent intrusion in a world that demanded obedience and concealment. Every footstep echoed with the weight of history, each creaking hinge in distant doors, reminding him that the building itself was a witness to secrets older than most of its occupants. He clutched a folder under his arm, the corners frayed from repeated handling, its contents layered with cryptic annotations, coded messages, and photographs that could destabilize alliances if mishandled. The folder was an artifact of Cold War strategy, a fragment of intelligence that had traveled through hands as careful as his own. In his mind, he replayed the instructions received weeks earlier, the timing of encounters, the names that could never be spoken, the sequence of corridors to traverse without attracting suspicion. Every movement was rehearsed, yet every moment carried the weight of uncertainty that defined real-world espionage. Behind the marble walls, whispers floated in corridors like ghosts. Some were innocent, administrative chatter, conversations between clerks, but others carried subtext, coded information, signals that could only be deciphered by trained operatives. He paused at a corner, pressing lightly against the wall to feel its vibrations, listening for footsteps that did not belong, for the subtle cadence of someone following protocol with a dangerous precision. The embassy was a stage of observation, and he was acutely aware that at any moment, eyes could appear where none were expected. Cameras were present, some obvious, some hidden. Agents were stationed discreetly, and the protocols of the building's security systems layered another barrier between him and discovery. He remembered his training vividly, the practice of moving unnoticed, of reading subtle cues in body language, the careful measurement of voice and gesture. Diplomats often underestimated the instinctive perception of those who had been trained in surveillance. A slight hesitation in a clerk's step, a hand brushing a pocket a moment too long, or the faint, repeated glance toward a stairwell could all reveal a hidden observer. His eyes flicked constantly, scanning the subtle signals of human behavior, cataloging anomalies in real time, translating physical cues into a mental map of potential threats. Somewhere deeper in the embassy, an encrypted radio whispered faintly, a low, intermittent clicking that would be imperceptible to untrained ears. It was a pulse of information, a heartbeat of intelligence being transmitted across the city in signals coded to vanish at the first scrutiny. Every tap, every pause, every subtle modulation in the radio's rhythm was laden with meaning. The operative knew that each transmission was a link in a chain, an invisible scaffold holding together a network that could not afford even a single error. He passed a closed office, pausing briefly to gauge the angle of the security camera reflected faintly in the polished floor. The image of his own reflection flickered against the wall, a ghostly double that seemed almost to judge him for his intrusion. He exhaled slowly, aware that patience was as critical as speed. One false move, one glance too long, and the veneer of casual presence could collapse into suspicion. In the history of espionage, mistakes were often not forgiven, and those who erred became case studies for the next generation of operatives. At the end of the corridor, a side door led to a narrower stairwell. He took it cautiously, descending into the semi-darkness, aware that these lesser-used spaces often served as conduits for movement without observation. Each step was deliberate, measured, absorbing the subtle sounds of the building, noting the acoustics and potential blind spots. The corridor behind him fell silent, the echoes fading into a muted hum, leaving him in a liminal space where the presence of past operatives seemed almost tangible. In a quiet alcove, he paused again, this time to observe a fleeting exchange between two embassy staff members. Words were spoken, but he focused on gestures, micro-tensions in the body, the tilt of heads, the weight of papers being shifted. Even in casual administrative interactions, trained eyes could discern signals, intentions, and priorities. His own gestures remained minimal, controlled, part of an ongoing dance that had evolved over years of clandestine operations. Despite the careful choreography, he could not escape the subtle tremor of anxiety. It was not fear, but awareness, a recognition that every step carried consequences. He thought of the broader network, of the operatives who had relied on him, of the intelligence that could alter geopolitical balances if mishandled. Each corridor, each reflective surface, each subtle sound became part of a larger mental map, a living document of risk, probability, and opportunity. At the end of the stairwell, he reached a small room, ostensibly empty, where a series of documents had been temporarily deposited for retrieval. The walls were lined with files, some innocuous, some coated with layers of security that only a trained operative could penetrate. He carefully extracted the envelope that had been deposited earlier, confirming its placement and integrity. The microfilm inside was small, almost laughably so, but its contents had the potential to shift alliances and destroy careers. Handling it required a practiced hand. Any sudden movement or lapse in attention could leave fingerprints, both literal and metaphorical, that would compromise the operation. As he prepared to depart, a faint movement in the reflection of a polished wall caught his attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him pause and recalibrate. Someone else was present, unseen but hinted at, moving with a rhythm that suggested purpose rather than accident. The awareness of an unseen observer added a layer of tension that was almost physical. The operative knew instinctively that this presence could be benign or lethal. The uncertainty itself was a tool, sharpening his senses, heightening the focus required to navigate the remaining distance to safety. The corridor's end opened into a wider hallway, more heavily trafficked, where the faint hum of air conditioning masked small movements. The man slowed, adjusting his gait to blend with the expected rhythm of staff and diplomats. He was a shadow among shadows, a ghost moving within an environment designed to host 1,000 innocuous interactions while concealing a single thread of dangerous significance. Every element of the space, the reflective floor, the polished walls, the muted lighting, was a participant in this silent play, amplifying the stakes and the consequences of even minor missteps. As he reached the outer exit, a sudden shift in the corridor's acoustic pattern made him freeze. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. He pressed lightly against the wall, letting the passing figure move ahead before continuing. The momentary pause was both instinctive and necessary, a ritual repeated countless times in the training rooms of intelligence agencies around the world. His heart rate, controlled and measured, betrayed none of the subtle adrenaline spike that sharpened his perception. Stepping out into the night, the cool air hit his face, bringing a fleeting clarity. The folder remained secure, microfilm intact, but the tension lingered, a reminder that no exchange, no corridor, and no moment of apparent safety could ever be assumed as such. Somewhere in the distance, lights flickered in the city. Pedestrians moved obliviously, and the hum of surveillance equipment continued its invisible vigil. Every element of the operation had been executed, yet the echo of potential discovery hung over him like a storm cloud waiting to break. The embassy had revealed only part of the story. In its silent, polished halls, whispers of past and future operations intersected, leaving a residue of uncertainty. As he moved into the shadows beyond the walls, blending with fog and night, the operative was acutely aware that this was far from over. Somewhere, unseen and unacknowledged, the eyes of the counterintelligence world followed every move. And in that awareness lay the constant tension, the quiet knowledge that every success was fleeting, every step a prelude to a new unseen challenge. He disappeared into the night, the embassy receding behind him, a silent giant holding countless secrets, each corridor and reflective surface, a participant in a drama of shadows and subtle betrayal. And somewhere, in the network of watchers and analysts, the next clue, the next misstep, waited to reveal itself. The game was far from concluded, and the shadows held many more secrets still. The fluorescent light above flickered once, before settling into a steady hum, casting the room in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The walls, gray and unadorned, seemed to press inward, closing the space into a suffocating box where every sound was amplified. The man, seated rigidly in the steel chair, felt the weight of decades of preparation collide with the raw intensity of the present moment. Across from him, the agents were statues of quiet control, notebooks open, pens poised, eyes sharp and unblinking. Every breath he drew seemed loud, echoing unnaturally in the stillness, betraying the tension that he fought to suppress. This was not the first interrogation of his life, but it was the first where stakes were higher than memory, higher than ideology, higher than the carefully cultivated persona he had constructed over years. Here, there were no safe alleys, no coded whispers, no shadows to blend into. Every word he spoke, every hesitation, every micro-expression was a potential piece of evidence, a thread that could unravel the carefully woven tapestry of his operations. The FBI had been patient, methodical, knowing that patience was a weapon more potent than coercion. They had spent weeks gathering intelligence, observing his habits, mapping his network. And now they had him, alone, in a room designed to strip away deception. The first question was simple, almost banal. Why were you at the Walmart last month? The simplicity of the question was deliberate, a baiting tactic. The agents did not need an immediate confession. They needed to gauge his reaction, measure the flicker of recognition, the micro changes in his posture, the micro tensions in his jaw. He answered with neutrality, voice controlled, rehearsed. His mind raced, calculating the implications of every syllable. Truth and deception had been tools for him for years, but here they were, double-edged, capable of cutting both ways with a single misstep. The agents leaned forward slightly, a subtle shift that altered the psychological landscape of the room. They were experts at this dance, trained to read the human body as if it were a book, interpreting the unspoken signals that escaped conscious control. Eyes that darted too frequently, hands that fidgeted, even the pace of breathing, all were data points to be analyzed. The man felt the invisible weight of scrutiny settle across his shoulders. He had trained to resist it, to maintain control, but even the best training could not erase the instinctive tightening of muscles that came with the recognition of imminent danger. They presented a folder, sliding it slowly across the metal table, letting the edge stop just short of his fingertips. Inside were photographs, some grainy, some disturbingly clear, all of them capturing moments that had been thought private, unseen, secure. Faces he had passed in corridors, hands exchanging envelopes, movements traced and recorded with clinical precision. He allowed his gaze to linger just long enough to acknowledge them without betraying recognition. The mental effort required exhausting in its subtlety. Each image was a reminder that in espionage, nothing remained hidden indefinitely. Every act, no matter how calculated, left traces for those trained to see. The room itself seemed to close in further, the overhead light amplifying every shadow, reflecting against the concrete walls in harsh, unflattering angles. A small recording device clicked softly, capturing every nuance of the conversation, every sigh, every hesitation. The man's mind cataloged the sound, mentally noting the rhythm and timing, aware that the mere act of speaking carried the risk of inadvertent confession. His thoughts moved in rapid sequences, recalling training exercises in counterinterrogation, rehearsed responses, ways to deflect without lying outright, techniques to protect networks while preserving his own freedom. Time stretched in a strange elasticity. Minutes felt like hours as the agents continued their careful, measured questioning. They introduced subtle cues, references to locations, dates, and names, each phrase to elicit a reaction, each designed to test consistency against known facts. He answered, measured and precise, aware that a slight pause, a micro-hesitation, could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. He felt a creeping awareness of how fragile his control truly was. Every memory, every recollection had been rehearsed, compartmentalized, and now tested under the unforgiving lens of observation. A subtle shift occurred as one agent produced a recording, a snippet of an intercepted conversation, played softly, almost innocuously, through a hidden speaker. The sound was faint, but the implication profound. It was a demonstration of reach, a display of capability, a reminder that walls and steel could not hide the evidence of his life's work. His heartbeat accelerated imperceptibly, a microbeat registering only to his own body, as his mind parsed the content, analyzing risk, consequence, and possible next steps. The psychological tension mounted with every passing second. Silence became another instrument in the agent's arsenal. Moments of pause, of measured stillness, forced reflection, forced anxiety. He felt the pressure like a physical presence weighing against his chest, a reminder that control could shift with a single revelation. He focused on steadying his breath, grounding himself in the mechanics of survival he had learned over decades of clandestine activity. He reminded himself that nothing was truly private, that information was fluid, and that the smallest gestures could betray far more than words ever could. The agents alternated techniques with subtle precision, alternating between soft empathy and quiet intimidation. Questions were layered, nested within one another, requiring answers that were both truthful enough to appear credible and ambiguous enough to conceal deeper truths. The operative's training was tested against the realities of human psychology, against the analytical rigor of seasoned interrogators. Each exchange became a microcosm of the Cold War itself, a battle of intellects, wills, and perception. where the stakes were measured not only in immediate outcomes, but in the unseen ramifications for networks, contacts, and operations stretching across continents. Hours seemed to merge into one continuous stretch of tension. His thoughts turned inward, recalling moments from past operations, the quiet triumphs of successfully evading detection, the subtle artistry of communication without words. Memory became both a tool and a trap, as recollection of previous exchanges, past codes, and embedded signals surfaced under pressure. The room, stark and unyielding, became a theater for mental simulation. Each scenario tested and discarded in the mind before it could manifest in reality. Eventually, a subtle misstep occurred. The man's hand moved slightly, brushing the edge of the table where the photographs were laid out. It was barely perceptible, almost instinctive, yet the agents noticed, their training allowing them to interpret the micro-gesture as a sign of recognition. Eyes flicked, hands shifted, and the interplay of awareness sharpened to a razor edge. The tension spiked, as if the air itself had become charged with electricity. The moment demanded immediate recalibration, mental discipline tested to the limit, as the operative maintained composure while calculating potential consequences of exposure. The agents probed deeper, referencing contacts, safe locations, and dead drops, seeking inconsistencies, testing reactions, measuring the subtle rhythms of speech and hesitation. He responded with caution, balancing truth and obfuscation, with a delicate precision that could have only been cultivated through years of training. He understood that even partial truth could be weaponized, that half measures in disclosure could unravel networks or imperil colleagues. Every utterance was weighed, every pause calculated, a constant exercise in psychological chess. As the night deepened, the interrogation shifted from questioning to observation. Agents leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, studying posture, micro-expressions, even the direction of gaze. Silence became loaded, a test of endurance, a pressure applied without physical force, but with an intensity no less powerful. He felt the strain, the slow erosion of control that occurred when under constant scrutiny, yet maintained his discipline, reminding himself that survival required patience, composure, and relentless calculation. In a brief moment of distraction, a faint sound from the hallway outside, a door closing, a distant footstep, caused the operative to flick his gaze up. A subtle, reflexive action. The agents noted it instantly, logging the response, understanding its implications in the broader context of intelligence gathering. It was in these small moments, the micro-reactions, that real truth could emerge, and he was acutely aware of their significance. Hours blurred, the weight of psychological pressure pressing relentlessly. The operative's training, experience, and instinct combined in a fragile equilibrium, allowing him to navigate the interrogation without revealing critical information. Yet the tension was palpable, a living entity in the room, coiling and uncoiling with every exchange. Each question, each subtle gesture, became part of a larger narrative, a story unfolding not just in words, but in posture, glance, and the invisible dialogue of human perception. As dawn approached, the agents finally paused, leaning back, allowing a silence to settle that felt almost like a reprieve. The operative remained seated, rigid, aware that the brief respite was tactical, that the interrogation was far from concluded, and that the battle of wills would continue. Every detail of the room, every micro-expression, every trace of sound had been catalogued and analyzed, forming a mosaic of understanding that would guide future actions. When he was finally escorted from the room, the weight of unseen observation remained. Every corridor, every reflective surface, every shadow of the building would now be interpreted through the lens of the interrogation, each step a continuation of the dance that had defined his life for years. The envelope, the microfilm, the coded signals, none of it could ever be truly secured again. The world of espionage, relentless and unforgiving, had imposed its will once more, leaving him with the knowledge that every success carried the seeds of potential exposure. And as the door closed behind him, the hum of the fluorescent light fading, the agents knew they had glimpsed only a fraction of the truth, a fraction that would guide them toward the next stage, toward the network that remained hidden beyond the walls of that room. The game was far from over, and every shadow, every whisper, every glance would continue to matter in ways no one outside the room could yet imagine. The fog clung to the alley with an almost sentient presence, swirling in muted waves that distorted the outlines of buildings and dim streetlights. Every step taken by the operative seemed amplified in the quiet cobblestone echoes mingling with distant sounds of the city, unremarkable to most but deadly in significance. He moved slowly, methodically, aware that in this business a single misstep could undo years of careful planning. The rusted metal of a dumpster became both concealment and landmark, its rough surface hiding a small package that held intelligence worth more than many lives. His gloved hand reached beneath the dumpster, feeling the familiar contours of the envelope wrapped in layers of plastic and tape. Inside, microfilm recorded hours of surveillance, coded instructions, and photographs of contacts whose identities were a tightly guarded secret. The sensation of the package in his hands was familiar, yet always charged with tension. Each retrieval was a ritual, each motion deliberate, designed to minimize exposure while maximizing control. The air smelled of damp metal and smoke, scents that had become almost comforting in their predictability amid the constant chaos of espionage. He glanced quickly up and down the alley, scanning for any signs of observation. Shadows moved in the mist, some innocuous, others potentially deadly. He had trained to recognize subtle irregularities, the slightest shift in silhouette, the misalignment of a shadow, the repetition of distant footsteps that could betray someone tailing him. Intelligence work was a dance of perception and reaction, each movement calculated against unseen variables. The fog softened edges but amplified uncertainty, turning the familiar urban terrain into a psychological minefield. The envelope was placed carefully inside his coat, pressed against his chest to keep it out of sight. He adjusted his stance, listening to the city, reading the rhythm of ambient sounds as if they were coded messages. Every alley had been used before for similar exchanges, yet each encounter was unique. Locations were chosen for their accessibility to both parties, but also for their vulnerability. It was a constant balance between operational efficiency and the imperative to remain unseen. He remembered the briefing before this dead drop, the precise instructions that had been rehearsed over multiple sessions. Times, locations, sequences of movement, expected signals, and contingencies in case of compromise had been memorized with a discipline born of necessity. Every operative who had handled such exchanges knew that the line between success and catastrophic exposure was often measured in seconds. And yet, the beauty of a successful dead drop lay in its simplicity, in the seamless blending of clandestine activity with the ordinary flow of urban life. A faint noise, a shuffling step against wet cobblestones, brought him to a brief pause. his head tilted slightly, eyes scanning through the mist, noting movement that could be nothing, could be everything. In this line of work, caution was instinct, awareness, a constant companion. He allowed a moment for the sound to pass, recalibrating, reassessing, acknowledging that at any moment his entire network could be compromised if vigilance faltered. The balance between action and stillness was as delicate as the contents of the envelope he carried. He continued along the alley toward the rendezvous point, a nondescript corner that concealed a small recess in the brick wall. There, he knew, another operative awaited the exchange. The timing was critical. Arrive too early or too late, and the operation could fail. He pressed against the wall, waiting for the figure to emerge from the fog. The moment stretched, each second laden with anticipation, with the invisible weight of intelligence that had traveled through multiple hands and locations to arrive here. From the shadows, a figure appeared, equally cautious, trench coat collar turned up against the damp night. Eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between trained professionals. The envelope changed hands with the fluidity of practiced precision, no words necessary, only the mutual understanding of what was at stake. Each motion was deliberate, yet seemingly effortless, a testament to countless repetitions in training rooms, back alleys, and abandoned stations. The intelligence had moved one step closer to its intended destination, but the danger remained, invisible yet pervasive. Even after the exchange, the operative did not relax. Every step away from the rendezvous was measured, every turn and glance calculated. He retraced his path with care, knowing that any trace, any anomaly, could be scrutinized by watchful eyes. The fog provided cover but also created hazards, concealing both allies and adversaries. Urban landscapes became arenas for perception, misperception, and the constant negotiation of risk. He allowed himself a brief reflection as he moved through the mist. Dead drops were more than physical transactions. They were psychological tests, a demonstration of trust, discipline, and composure under pressure. One misstep could cascade through a network, imperiling colleagues and compromising operations. Yet the satisfaction of a successful exchange was profound, a quiet triumph amid the shadows of secrecy. The microfilm he carried now represented more than information. It was a symbol of control, knowledge, and survival in a world where both were fragile and contested. A distant siren echoed, distant yet unnervingly close, a reminder that the ordinary world continued around these clandestine actions. The operative's senses remained heightened, aware that the city itself was a participant, a living organism whose rhythms could betray or protect. Every shadow, every reflective surface, every movement in the fog was interpreted through the lens of training and instinct. The intelligence, now in new hands, would continue its journey, a small thread in a vast tapestry of Cold War espionage that spanned continents and decades. The alley receded behind him as he moved toward safer streets, blending into the ordinary night. The operation was a success, yet the tension lingered, an invisible residue carried in every cautious step, in every fleeting glance over the shoulder. Dead drops were moments of intense focus, encapsulated in minutes, yet their consequences extended far beyond the narrow alley. They were tests of skill, endurance, and mental fortitude, and each successful completion reinforced the invisible architecture of trust and vigilance that held entire networks together. As he disappeared into the night, the fog curling behind him like smoke from a distant fire, the operative understood that every secret moved through layers of concealment and observation. Each handoff, each retrieval, Each silent communication was a link in a chain that required both precision and discretion. In the shadows of the city, the game of espionage continued, unobserved by the ordinary world, yet shaping events in ways invisible but profound. And somewhere in the mist, the next dead drop awaited, the next envelope, the next carefully orchestrated exchange. The tension never fully dissipated, the vigilance never ended, and the secrets remained alive, moving quietly through the streets, unseen yet vital, shaping the balance of knowledge, power, and survival. The city was alive with ordinary motion, oblivious to the invisible game unfolding in its midst. From the darkened windows of an unmarked surveillance van, agents observed, logging movement, counting patterns, noting routines. Every shadow on the cracked asphalt, every pedestrian's deviation from the expected path was a potential signal, a thread in a web of intelligence. The operative moved through the streets with careful rhythm, unaware of the silent scrutiny, yet entirely governed by habits instilled through years of training. Inside the van, multiple screens displayed overlapping feeds from cameras hidden across the neighborhood. Each lens captured fragments of life that seemed mundane, but were rich in context. The slight tilt of a head, the brush of a hand against a coat pocket, the hesitant glance toward an alley, all conveyed information. Agents annotated, cross-referenced, and triangulated movement with quiet precision. Surveillance was not about immediate intervention. It was about mapping possibilities, predicting behavior, and maintaining a quiet, watchful presence that could never be revealed. Outside, the operative paused at a cafe corner, adjusting his coat to obscure the package concealed beneath. His gaze flicked toward reflective windows and puddles on the asphalt, scanning for anomalies. He was aware that cameras might catch him, that patterns could betray him, yet he moved with the confidence of training. Every step was both deliberate and cautious, every gesture measured. He did not know the eyes watching, but the invisible tension pressed against him as though the city itself were holding its breath. The van's interior was silent except for the faint hum of monitors and the soft tap of keyboards. Agents shared subtle nods, micro-expressions that spoke volumes about data, patterns, and irregularities. Each observation was a potential breakthrough or a warning. Surveillance was a patient discipline, a psychological endurance test, as much about understanding human nature as mastering technology. The operative was a participant without knowing it, his every motion a puzzle to be interpreted by those trained to see what was hidden. Across the street, a pedestrian lingered a moment too long, a cigarette glowing faintly in the fog. The agents noted the presence, weighing it against routines, timings, and possible affiliations. Nothing went unexamined, no detail too small. Even the city itself, with its flickering lights, uneven sidewalks, and occasional siren, became a participant in the intelligence exercise, influencing perception and choice. The operative finally moved on, blending with the crowd, disappearing into the rhythm of the city. From inside the van, the agents tracked, logging his trajectory, noting deviations, and updating their mental map. Each step forward, each turn taken, was both mundane and critical, an action in a silent chess game whose stakes were invisible but immense. The success of operations often relied not on confrontation, but on understanding, predicting, and outmaneuvering an unseen adversary. As the night deepened, the streets emptied, leaving only shadows and reflective puddles. The van continued its quiet watch, monitors glowing in the dim interior, agents poised for any irregularity. Outside, the operative's footsteps faded into alleys, corners, and intersections, yet the surveillance persisted, a quiet, patient witness to every move. Intelligence was never static, and vigilance never ceased. The balance between observer and observed remained fragile, contingent on discipline, perception, and an unyielding awareness of consequence. The surveillance game was never over. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every reflection could betray, and every ordinary act could carry extraordinary significance. And in the quiet hum of the unmarked van, the tension endured, a reminder that in this city, nothing was truly private, and nothing was left to chance. The safe house smelled of damp wood and stale air, the kind of scent that clung to clothes and lingered in the memory long after leaving. Inside, the operative sat across a small table from a figure whose identity was known, but whose loyalty had always been assumed rather than proven. Shadows stretched along the walls, warped by the single bare bulb, creating a theater of tension where every glance, every gesture could carry lethal significance. The envelope exchanged hands with the quiet gravity of ritual, the weight of its contents far exceeding its physical bulk. The operative's mind raced, parsing the situation with the instincts of years spent navigating deception and danger. Safe houses were never truly safe. Every arrangement, every contact carried the potential for betrayal. He had rehearsed contingencies countless times, memorized escape routes, rehearsed dead drop procedures, and yet the subtle tremor in the other man's hands betrayed something unspoken. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but in this world, even the smallest sign could be a signal of disloyalty. He remembered earlier instructions, coded messages intercepted and analyzed, patterns of behavior that suggested compromise. Each had been weighed against plausibility, dismissed as noise. Yet the gut instinct honed by years of espionage whispered that something was off. In intelligence work, intuition was both weapon and warning. He could not act on it openly, not yet. The moment demanded patience, the careful navigation of tension, the silent probing of truth beneath the surface. The exchange continued with quiet formality. Words were minimal, necessary only to affirm receipt, yet every silence was heavy with implication. The operative observed posture, breathing, eye movement, gestures of concealment or tension, reading them as data points in a living map of risk. He recalled similar encounters from his past, the betrayals that had come from the least expected corners, the colleagues whose smiles masked loyalty to another cause. Every historical lesson reinforced the imperative to maintain vigilance, to assume that nothing could be taken at face value. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the delicate choreography unfolding within the walls of the safe house. Footsteps echoed faintly in the distance. Streetlights flickered through grimy windows, and the operative remained motionless, a study in control and anticipation. His mind ran through scenarios of compromise, planning multiple contingencies for each possibility. Escape routes were visualized, cover stories rehearsed, and signals prepared. Yet he knew that true betrayal often arrived in subtle ways, hidden beneath normalcy, striking when least expected. The other figure shifted, a barely perceptible hesitation that sent an immediate signal through the operative's awareness. It was not enough to act on, yet it was enough to alert, enough to demand caution. He allowed the envelope to rest in his hands, contained, untouched, as he measured his next steps. Trust in this world was conditional, provisional, constantly tested against evidence, intuition, and circumstance. He had survived by recognizing that loyalty was fluid and deception was inevitable. Memories of past missions surfaced, instances where colleagues had quietly undermined operations, where information had been compromised by the seemingly mundane. Each recollection sharpened his attention, made him more vigilant. He understood that betrayal was rarely dramatic. It was almost always incremental, a whisper in the right ear, a delayed message, a misdirected glance. And now, in this dimly lit room, the echoes of that understanding pressed down with the gravity of inevitability. The envelope was secured, yet the operative's mind remained alert to the potential for disruption. He observed movements, timing, and reactions, piecing together the psychological landscape. Every action, from the tilt of a shoulder to the pace of a sigh, became part of a pattern he read with clinical precision. The safe house, though ostensibly neutral, was a stage for invisible strategies, a site where trust and deception collided in silence. As the minutes stretched, a subtle signal outside the window caught his attention, a shadow against the brick wall, a movement too deliberate to be accidental. His instincts flared, recognizing the possibility that someone was watching, that the safe house might already be compromised. The presence was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of danger that demanded immediate consideration. He did not move, did not react overtly, but every sense sharpened, every thought measured against the consequences of exposure. The operative realized that the betrayal, if it existed, was patient, subtle, waiting for the right moment to unspool its consequences. The safe house became a crucible, a test of awareness, intuition, and control. He allowed himself only minimal movement, maintaining composure while scanning possibilities, analyzing risk, and preparing for the inevitability that some truth would emerge, some hidden hand would reveal itself. As he departed the safe house, envelope secure and body composed, the tension lingered like smoke in the air. Outside, the streets offered anonymity but no certainty. Every step forward carried the potential for discovery. Every reflection in a window or puddle could conceal surveillance. He moved with deliberate caution, aware that the network was fragile, that betrayal could exist anywhere, and that vigilance was the only guarantee of survival. The game of espionage was unforgiving, and betrayal was an invisible predator. Even in success, the operative carried the knowledge that trust was provisional, that loyalty was never absolute, and that the next move in the delicate dance of secrecy could shift the balance between life and exposure. In the shadows of the city, the silent threat persisted, shaping every decision, every movement, and every thought. A reminder that in intelligence, betrayal was not a possibility, but a certainty, waiting for opportunity. The basement smelled of dust and electricity, a static tang that seemed to cling to the walls, and the figure crouched among the jumble of radios and wires. Every adjustment of a dial, every flick of a switch, carried significance beyond the immediate sound. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of machines, a mechanical heartbeat synchronizing with the tension in the operative's chest. Here, the world above did not exist. Time itself seemed suspended, measured only in the pulses of encrypted transmissions moving invisibly through the air. He leaned closer to one of the radios, listening intently to a series of low, intermittent beeps that carried instructions embedded in patterns decipherable only to trained ears. The rhythm of the transmission was familiar, the cadence rehearsed over months of practice. One misinterpretation, one missed signal could compromise networks, expose agents, and unravel years of careful orchestration. The air was heavy with anticipation, charged with the weight of secrets that could change outcomes without a single visible gesture. A folded sheet of microfilm lay nearby, its images illuminated by a weak lamp. Each frame contained coded instructions, photographs of locations and contacts, and annotations in a cipher only he could read. His eyes moved quickly across the symbols, cross-referencing with the faint tones emanating from the radio. The act was simultaneously technical and psychological, demanding complete focus, patience, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Every element of the transmission, every nuance, was a key to survival. Outside, the city moved unknowingly, indifferent to the invisible currents of espionage flowing beneath its streets. The operative's awareness was total, absorbing the flicker of light through cracks, the distant sounds of movement, every irregularity that might hint at observation. Surveillance was never passive. Every quiet moment could be the prelude to exposure. He remained still, his mind mapping possible threats, calculating routes of escape, and preparing contingencies should the transmission be intercepted. The final tones of the message signaled completion, yet the tension did not lift. Each successful reception was temporary relief, a reminder that the network relied on constant vigilance and precise execution. He folded the microfilm carefully, securing it in his coat, aware that its contents were valuable beyond measure. Every hand that touched it, every moment it remained exposed, increased risk. And yet it also represented control, knowledge, and the ability to act within the shadows, unseen. As he extinguished the lamp and moved toward the staircase leading to the street above, the operative felt the weight of unseen eyes. Safe houses, radios, dead drops, and encrypted signals were all part of a choreography designed to keep information flowing while minimizing exposure. Yet the threat of compromise lingered, an ever-present shadow that could appear without warning, altering the trajectory of months of planning in an instant. The hidden transmission was more than a technical exercise. It was a lifeline connecting distant nodes in a network that spanned continents. Each successful exchange reinforced the fragile architecture of trust, discretion, and skill upon which all operations depended. And yet, for all its precision, it was a moment of vulnerability, a reminder that in espionage, control was never complete and certainty was an illusion. Emerging into the cold night, the operative disappeared into shadows, carrying the microfilm that represented both information and danger. The city around him was ordinary, mundane, oblivious to the silent game played beneath its surface. Yet every movement, every glance, every decision now held the weight of consequence. The hidden transmission was complete, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the corrugated metal of the loading dock and creating puddles that reflected the dim glow of distant streetlights. The operative moved swiftly, coat-soaked, gloves gripping the envelope of microfilm that had been the center of countless exchanges, countless risks. The streets were deserted, but he knew better than to trust emptiness. Every shadow could conceal observation, every reflection could betray a tale. The night was a chessboard, and every movement carried consequence. Across the dock, figures emerged from the fog, moving with practiced precision. They were part of the network, trusted to the degree that trust could exist in a world built on deception. Briefcases were exchanged with fluid gestures, hands brushing only enough to signify the transfer, eyes locking briefly to confirm identity. No words were spoken. Silence was the language of operations, and in silence, everything was communicated. The operative's mind raced even as his body moved automatically. Escape routes were mapped in memory, contingencies rehearsed with the precision that years of training demanded. Every instinct was alert, every sense sharpened to the possibility of exposure. He recalled the countless steps that had led to this moment. The surveillance, the dead drops, the encoded messages, the betrayals, the narrow escapes. Each had been a test of skill, patience, and nerve, and now it all converged at this rain-slicked dock under the cover of darkness. A distant sound, the scrape of a boot against concrete, caused a momentary pause. The operative's eyes scanned the periphery, noting movement in the shadows, subtle anomalies that could indicate danger. His hand tightened around the envelope, a microfilm that represented not just intelligence, but the culmination of operations spanning weeks. In espionage, the final step was often the most perilous. Success was never guaranteed, and the line between extraction and exposure was razor thin. The van waited, headlights dimmed, engine off, a silent promise of transport and protection. Operatives loaded their packages, moving with the fluidity of rehearsed choreography. The operative approached, slipping into the vehicle as another hand closed the door behind him. Inside, the interior was tight and dimly lit, the hum of the engine beginning to replace the rhythm of rain. He exhaled, barely perceptibly, but remained alert. Relief was temporary, vigilance eternal. As the van rolled through the foggy streets, the operative's mind traced the network of events backward and forward. Every signal, every observation, every encounter had been part of a web of coordination designed to maintain secrecy and security. The success of this extraction was both culmination and prelude. Intelligence moved, decisions were informed, and yet the consequences of exposure could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. The city outside was ordinary, mundane, oblivious to the invisible struggle that had unfolded in its midst. Finally, the van reached a secure location, an unassuming building whose purpose would remain invisible to anyone outside the network. The operative disembarked, envelope intact, body tense but steady. Inside, the microfilm was transferred to a secure container, stored away for analysis, its contents now safe from immediate observation, but ready to inform decisions across continents. The extraction was complete, yet the operative knew that in espionage, completion was only temporary. Every success invited scrutiny, every secret invited challenge, and vigilance never ended. As the rain eased and dawn began to break, the operative allowed himself a fleeting moment of quiet reflection. The streets shimmered wet and deserted, fog curling in corners, the world oblivious to the invisible battles fought beneath its surface. Intelligence had moved, networks remained intact, and a chapter of the Cold War had quietly concluded. Yet the shadow of threat lingered, a constant companion in a world where trust was fleeting, loyalty was tested, and secrecy was both weapon and shield. The final extraction was more than survival. It was the silent triumph of discipline, skill, and courage, a reminder that history is often shaped not by what the world sees, but by what it does not. And now, as you watch this story unfold, remember that the hidden struggles of espionage left traces in streets, alleys, and silent rooms around the world. If you want to uncover more classified operations, hidden Cold War secrets, and unbelievable spy stories that history tried to erase, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every shadow has a story, and some of them are stranger than fiction.